The silence was louder than the thunder. Lee Jae-Min stood like a monolith under a black silk umbrella, the rain drumming an aggressive beat against the fabric. His slicked-back hair was perfect, and the dark tattoos snaking up his neck warned the world that he was a man who dealt in shadows. Behind him, 2 bodyguards stood like stone statues, their hands folded and eyes scanning the perimeter. They were trained to break ribs for their boss, but they were not prepared for what happened next. A small, 7-year-old girl named Zina stepped out of the downpour. She didn't cross the street to avoid his gaze like most grown men in Seoul. Instead, she walked straight into his personal space, her colorful hair beads clinking softly like a bell ringing in a graveyard. Without a hint of fear, she wrapped her small arms around his waist in a tight, instinctive hug. As her denim jacket soaked up the rain, she looked up into the eyes of the city's most feared man and whispered a question that no one had dared ask him in 20 years. "Are you okay?" Can a single hug from an innocent child truly melt the heart of the city's most dangerous man, or is Lee Jae-Min's past too dark for a second chance? Drop a heart in the comments if you believe in redemption. And make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss Chapter 1, where the Iron King decides to go to war for the family that dared to love him. The world of Lee Jae-Min was built on cold stone and iron rules. As he stood there, feeling the small, warm weight of Zina's hug against his waist, time seemed to stop. For years, people had only looked at him with terror or greed. They saw the expensive suits, the sharp jawline, and the dark tattoos that crawled up his neck like warning signs. They saw a man who owned the shadows of the city, not a person who had feelings of his own. But this little girl was different. Zina didn't care about his reputation or the scary men standing behind him. Her small hands squeezed tightly, and the colorful beads in her hair made a soft, happy sound that cut through the heavy rhythm of the rain. When she whispered that question, asking if he was okay, it felt like a crack appearing in a thick wall of ice. Jae-Min looked down at her, and for a second his intense gaze softened. He realized that beneath his calm mask, he was carrying a weight that was heavier than any empire. He was tired, he was lonely, he was gray in a way that had nothing to do with the stormy sky. His bodyguards shifted behind him, their shoes splashing in the puddles. They were confused. They were trained to fight off assassins, but they didn't know how to handle a child offering a hug. Jae-Min didn't move. He didn't pull away. He simply stood there, letting the rain soak into his white shirt, feeling a strange, new warmth spreading through his chest. He spent every day making sure everyone else followed his orders, yet he had forgotten how it felt to simply be seen as a human being. Deep down, Jae-Min knew his life was a storm of violence and secrets. He had power, he had money, and he had control over the streets, but none of those things could answer the girl's simple question. He realized that the silence he lived in wasn't peace, it was just a lack of sound. As he looked into Zina's bright, trusting eyes, the mask of stone he had worn for 35 years began to feel very heavy. For the first time, the King of the Dark wondered if there was a way to step out of the shadows and find the light she seemed to carry so easily. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of frantic footsteps splashing through the deep puddles. Christie ran toward them, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps that mirrored the rhythm of the falling rain. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she saw her daughter standing dangerously close to the man with the black umbrella. She didn't just see a tall man in a suit. She saw the warning signs that most people in the city knew to avoid. She saw the dark tattoos on his neck, and the 2 bodyguards who stood behind him like unmoving stone statues. "Zina, no! Come here right now!" Christie cried out, her voice trembling with a deep, visceral terror. She reached forward and quickly pulled the little girl away, tucking Zina safely behind her legs. Christie felt small and vulnerable in the shadow of the great building, her thin jacket already soaked through by the downpour. She began to bow deeply and repeatedly to Jae-Min, her eyes fixed on the ground because she was too afraid to look him in the face. "I am so sorry, sir," Christie whispered, her words shaking as much as her hands. "She is just a child. She didn't mean to bother you or get your suit wet. Please, please forgive her." She was terrified because she knew that in this part of the city, powerful men like Jae-Min didn't like to be touched or interrupted. To her, he was a king of the dark world, a man who dealt in shadows and expected everyone to stay out of his way. Jae-Min remained silent, watching the mother protect her child with a fierce, desperate love. He saw the exhaustion in Christie's eyes, the kind of tiredness that goes much deeper than just needing sleep. It was the look of a woman who was drowning in a cycle of debt and survival, fighting every day to keep her daughter safe in a world that wasn't always kind to immigrants. He looked at his empty hand, where Zina's warmth had just been, then back at Christie's shaking shoulders. For the first time, he didn't feel like a boss being bothered. He felt like a man who wanted to tell her she didn't have to be afraid. The neon lights of the convenience store flickered as Christie clocked into her second shift. Outside, the rain continued to pour, turning the streets of the Mapo district into a blurry mess of gray. She watched Zina coloring on a piece of cardboard in the back room, trying to keep her daughter hidden from the world. Christie's hands were shaking as she stocked the shelves with ramen. She had moved to Korea for a better life, but now she was drowning in a cycle of debt. She owed a lot of money to Kwan-Ho Ryu, a man who charged huge interest every week and didn't care who he hurt. Suddenly, the store door swung open with a loud crash. 3 men walked in, but they weren't wearing nice suits like Jae-Min. They wore cheap tracksuits and gold chains, looking like scavengers searching for a meal. They were the low-level bullies who only picked on people who couldn't fight back. The leader slammed his hand on the counter, making the candy displays rattle. "Where is our money?" the man shouted, his voice filling the small store. Christie turned pale, her heart hammering against her ribs again. She begged them to wait until Friday, reminding them that her daughter was right there in the back. But the leader didn't care. He leaned over the counter and threw a display of candy across the floor. He threatened to start taking things from the store, or even worse, he threatened to take Zina. Christie felt completely alone, but she didn't know that a black car was parked just outside in the shadows. Inside the car, Jae-Min was watching the store monitors through a hacked feed on his tablet. He had seen how hard Christie worked and how she shared her small bit of bread with Zina. When the scavenger in the store mentioned taking the little girl, Jae-Min's grip tightened on his umbrella until his knuckles turned white. He didn't wait for his bodyguards to open his door. He stepped out into the rain, his face as cold as a frozen lake, ready to show these scavengers that they had picked the wrong family to haunt. The drive to the Gangnam district was very quiet. The only sound was the soft humming of the expensive black car and Zina's gentle breathing as she fell asleep against Christie's side. Christie looked out the window at the bright neon signs of Seoul. The city lights looked like streaks of blue and red, but she felt like a prisoner even though the leather seats were softer than any bed she had ever used. In the front seat, Jae-Min sat perfectly still. He looked like a sharp shadow in the dark car. Christie finally whispered a question, asking where he was taking them. Jae-Min looked at her through the mirror. He explained that the men he had just removed from the store were low-level bullies, but their boss, Kwan-Ho Ryu, was a dangerous man who did not like losing. He told her that if he had left them at the store, they would not have survived the night. He told her they were not being kidnapped, but were being moved to a safe place. Christie tried to argue that she needed her job and her paycheck, but Jae-Min spoke coldly. He reminded her that her debt was much larger than her pay, and to the bad men, her life was worth nothing. The car pulled into a garage under a giant building made of glass and steel that looked like a fortress. Jae-Min's lead bodyguard, Minyu, opened the door for them. They were led up to a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. It was very clean and smelled of expensive wood and rain. Jae-Min pointed to a guest room that was bigger than their whole apartment and told them to sleep. He told them there was food in the kitchen and clean clothes in the closet. Christie stepped toward him, feeling brave for a moment. She asked if they were safe from the world or if they needed to be safe from him, too. Jae-Min walked closer until he was standing right in front of her. Christie could see the old scars on his hands and the deep tiredness in his eyes that Zina had noticed earlier. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small chocolate bar he had grabbed from the store during the fight. He handed it to her and said they were safe from everyone. As Christie held the small candy, she realized this gilded sanctuary was a strange new world, and the King of the Dark was the only one standing between them and the storm. The night air at the Incheon shipyard was thick with the smell of salt and rusty metal. Huge shipping containers were stacked high like giant building blocks, creating a maze of shadows. Jae-Min stood in the center of a wide, open space, lit only by a single flickering street lamp. He was alone. He had told his bodyguards to stay back because he wanted this to be a conversation between two leaders. However, Kwan-Ho Ryu did not play by the rules of honor. From the darkness, a dozen men stepped out, carrying heavy metal pipes and wooden bats. Finally, Kwan-Ho Ryu appeared. He was a shorter man with a mean smile and eyes that looked like a snake's. He laughed when he saw Jae-Min. He told Jae-Min that he was getting soft, worrying about a woman and a little girl who meant nothing to the business. Kwan-Ho Ryu didn't want the money Jae-Min offered to pay off the debt. He wanted to embarrass the great Lee Jae-Min and take over his territory. "You think a hug makes you a hero?" Kwan-Ho Ryu mocked, signaled his men to move closer. "In this city, kindness is just a weakness that makes it easier for me to kill you." Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed through the docks. Kwan-Ho Ryu had a secret weapon. He signaled toward a crane where a small, terrified figure was being held by one of his thugs. It was Christie. She had been captured while Jae-Min was on his way to the meeting. The scavenger leader told Jae-Min to drop his umbrella and get on his knees, or Christie would never see her daughter again. Jae-Min didn't flinch. His face remained as still as a mask of stone, but his heart was racing. He looked at Christie, who was crying but shaking her head, telling him to run. Jae-Min realized that his power and his money couldn't solve this. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting to protect his empire or his pride. He was fighting for the people who had shown him that he was more than just a monster. He took a slow step forward, even as the men circled him with their weapons raised, preparing for a sacrifice that would change everything. The sound of the ocean waves hitting the metal docks was the only noise in the heavy silence. Kwan-Ho Ryu leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a cruel light. He held a cold, silver pistol, and he slowly pressed the barrel against Christie's temple. She was shaking, her eyes squeezed shut, praying for Zina's future. Jae-Min stood just a few feet away. His expensive white shirt was ruined by the rain, and his hands were empty. He had all the power in the city, but in this moment, power felt like nothing. "You have two choices, Jae-Min," Kwan-Ho Ryu hissed, his voice like a snake in the grass. "You can walk away and keep your empire, or you can stay here and watch her disappear. What is the life of one immigrant woman worth to a king?" Jae-Min didn't hesitate. He took a long, steady step forward until the cold metal of the gun was no longer touching Christie. With a calm, firm hand, he reached out and moved the muzzle of the pistol away from her head. He placed the barrel of the gun directly against his own forehead. The thugs around them gasped, and even Kwan-Ho Ryu's smile faded into a look of pure shock. Nobody in the dark world ever sacrificed themselves for someone else. "Her life is worth everything," Jae-Min said, his voice deep and steady. "Because she and her daughter saw a man when the rest of you only saw a monster. If you want to kill the hope in this city, you have to start with me." Kwan-Ho Ryu stood frozen with the gun still pressed against Jae-Min's forehead. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a sudden realization that he had already lost. He looked into Jae-Min's eyes and saw no terror, only a cold, sharp intelligence. Jae-Min had not come to the shipyard just to be a hero. He had come to finish a job. While the rain washed the blood and dirt from his face, Jae-Min reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glowing burner phone. "You think you are untouchable because you pay off the police and the prosecutors," Jae-Min said, his voice echoing through the hollow shipping containers. "But you forgot one thing. Men like me keep records of everyone we buy." Jae-Min pressed a button on the phone, and a recording began to play. It was the voice of the city's top prosecutor, the man who had been protecting Kwan-Ho Ryu for years. In the recording, the prosecutor clearly discussed the illegal debts, the threats against Christie, and the plan to get rid of anyone who stood in their way. Jae-Min had spent years gathering this evidence as insurance, and now he was using it to burn the whole system down. "This recording is already being sent to the national news and the Internal Affairs Office," Jae-Min explained. "By the time the sun comes up, your bank accounts will be frozen, and your friends in high places will be in handcuffs. You aren't a big man anymore, Kwan-Ho. You are just a scavenger with nowhere to hide." The men with the metal pipes began to drop their weapons. They knew that when the law came for the boss, it came for everyone. Kwan-Ho Ryu dropped the silver pistol into the mud, his face turning pale. He realized that Jae-Min had used his mind and his deep connections to do what 1,000 guns could never do. He had erased the rot from the inside out. Jae-Min walked over to Christie and untied her hands. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief. He held her firmly, looking out at the dark ocean. For the first time in his career, he had used his dark influence to create something good. He wasn't just clearing a debt, he was clearing the way for a future where people like Zina didn't have to live in fear of the shadows. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Jae-Min knew that the King of the Dark was finally finishing his final piece of business. The morning sun over Seoul felt different 6 months later. It was no longer cold or hidden behind heavy rain clouds. Instead, it was soft and golden, warming the bricks of a brand new building in a quiet part of the city. A large sign above the door read, "The Zina Center." It wasn't a place for business or shadows. It was a place for families who had traveled far from home to find a safe place to rest and learn. Lee Jae-Min stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building. He wasn't wearing his expensive, sharp suits anymore. Instead, he wore a simple, dark sweater that made him look like any other neighbor. The tattoos on his neck were still there, but they no longer looked like warnings. His face, which used to be called the grayest face in the city, now looked calm. He finally looked like a man who had finished a long, hard journey. Inside the center, the sound of laughter bounced off the walls. Zina was running through the hallway, her colorful beads clinking like music with every step she took. She saw Jae-Min through the glass door and ran out to give him a giant hug, just like she had done that first day in the rain. This time, Jae-Min didn't stand like a statue. He knelt down and patted her hair, his eyes crinkling with a real smile. Christie came out behind her daughter, holding a stack of books for the afternoon English class. She and Jae-Min were not a couple, but they had become something very special, true family friends. They shared a bond that was stronger than gold. Jae-Min had used his money to fund the center, and Christie used her strength to run it. They were partners in making the world a little brighter for people who felt lost. "The new students are arriving at noon," Christie said, her voice steady and full of hope. Jae-Min nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride. He had spent most of his 35 years taking things away from the world, but now he was finally giving something back. As they stood together watching the city wake up, Jae-Min realized that Zina was right all along. He had been hungry for kindness, and that simple hug had saved him. He was no longer a man of shadows living in a fortress. He was a man with a home, surrounded by people who loved him for who he was, not what he owned. The King of the Dark was gone, and in his place was a man who had finally stepped into the light. This is the story of how a small act of kindness can melt the hardest heart. Lee Jae-Min lived in darkness until a little girl saw his pain and dared to ask, "Are you okay?" It reminds us all that no one is ever too lost to be found. If you enjoyed this journey of hope and second chance, please like this video and share it with your friends. Subscribe now so you never miss a story that touches the soul. Thank you for watching.